All right, let's dive in. Today we're going deep on procurement.
Yeah, procurement.
Seems like we've got some interesting stuff to work with today. We've got chapters from a data warehousing book
Mm-hmm.
and I think a sneak peek at your company's actual procurement data model.
Yeah.
So we're going to be uncovering how businesses track their purchasing and learn the secrets to keep that data clean and insightful, even when things change.
Exactly. It's all about making sure you have the right information at the right time. And believe me, procurement is critical for pretty much every business out there. It's how they get everything.
Oh yeah, from raw materials to those office supplies we all can't live without.
Right. And as someone who spent years in data warehousing and dimensional modeling, I can tell you getting this right is absolutely critical for making smart decisions. You need to model the data in a way that makes sense.
Okay, so let's back up for a second and set the scene here. Procurement is basically just buying stuff, right?
Yeah, in the simplest terms.
But in a business context, it's obviously a bit more involved than just, adding things to your online shopping cart.
Definitely. Think of a large retailer. They're constantly buying products from tons of different suppliers to keep their shelves stocked. That entire process from figuring out what to buy, negotiating prices, placing orders, receiving shipments, and making payments, that's all part of procurement.
So it's not just the purchase itself, but managing that whole life cycle of acquiring goods and services.
Exactly. And companies are always looking for ways to optimize that life cycle, right? They want to know which products are selling like hotcakes, which suppliers are the most reliable.
And of course, if there are ways to save some money,
You got it. Without sacrificing quality, though. And that's where data comes in.
now it's all starting to click. We're not just talking about, keeping track of receipts, but about really analyzing that data to find those hidden patterns and opportunities.
Right. And to do that effectively, we need to structure the data in a way that makes sense. Remember the inventory model we talked about before with the fact tables and dimensions?
Yeah, yeah.
Those same concepts apply here.
Okay, so remind me, how do those fit into the procurement picture?
Well, think of a fact table as a record of each purchase.
Okay,
It tells you what was bought, when, from whom, and for how much.
right.
The dimensions then provide context.
Uh-huh.
They tell you more about the product, the supplier, the date, and so on.
So if the fact table is the what's of the purchase, the dimensions are the who, when, and where.
Yeah, perfect analogy. And don't forget about the grain. Remember, the grain is the level of detail captured in each row of your fact table.
Right, right.
And for procurement, that might be a single purchase transaction,
Okay.
or it could be something else. It all depends on your specific needs.
And the cool thing is we can reuse some of those dimensions we already built for the inventory model,
Right.
things like our date dimension and product dimension.
Absolutely. That's one of the great things about dimensional modeling. We create reusable building blocks that ensures consistency across our entire data warehouse. But sometimes things can get a bit more complex, even with something like procurement.
Oh, I have a feeling you're about to throw a wrench into our nice and organized data system.
Well, let's say you are working with a company that handles millions of transactions a year.
Okay, yeah, lots of data.
Is one giant fact table the best way to manage all of that? Or are there situations where using separate fact tables might be more effective?
That's a good question. One massive table versus several smaller ones. What are the factors that go into making that decision?
Well, it really boils down to a few key things. First, you need to understand the needs of the users. You also need to think about the specific business processes the company uses,
Okay,
the source systems the data is coming from, and of course, that grain we were talking about.
all right, let's break those down one by one. First up, user needs. That's about how people are actually going to be analyzing this data, right?
Exactly.
Like if they're always looking at purchase orders separately from receipts,
Yeah.
it wouldn't make sense to lump all of that together into a single table.
Right. You need to structure the data to align with how people are using it.
Makes sense. What about those business processes you mentioned? How do those play a role?
Well, imagine a company where each department handles its own procurement.
Okay.
That might suggest you need separate fact tables to reflect those distinct processes. Remember how in the last deep dive we talked about inventory being like a single process?
Uh-huh.
Procurement can be more nuanced than that.
So different departments might even track unique data points, like specific approval workflows or budget codes.
Exactly.
That would make separate tables seem a lot more appealing.
Right.
But how do we know if those processes are really distinct enough to warrant separate tables?
That's a great question. One clue is to look at the source systems. If purchase orders and receipts are coming from totally different systems,
Oh, okay.
that could be a sign that they need their own space in the data warehouse.
Okay, so source systems, user needs, and business processes. Got it. Now, remind me about that whole grain thing again. How does that factor into this decision?
Think about the level of detail we're capturing for different transaction types. The book uses the example of purchase orders versus receipts.
Okay,
A purchase order might have several line items,
right.
each with a different product and quantity, while the receipt simply acknowledges that those goods arrived.
So the receipt might not have that same level of detail about those individual products.
That's right, and that can influence how you design your fact tables.
Interesting, but how do we visualize all of this to make the right call about using a single versus multiple fact tables?
Well, that's where the bus matrix comes in handy. It's a visual tool that can help us map out our fact tables and dimensions.
Okay.
And it lets us see which data points belong where and identify the atomic granularity, meaning the most basic level of detail for each process. Yeah, it's like having a blueprint for your data warehouse. You can see all the moving parts, how they connect, and where those natural dividing lines might be for creating those separate fact tables.
So it helps us see if we're dealing with one interconnected procurement system or several separate processes that need their own space. Clever. But hold on, there's this term the book mentions, snapshot fact table. What are those all about?
Yes, snapshot fact tables are like taking a series of photos of your procurement process over time.
Okay.
They let you see how things are moving, how long each step is taking, and where any bottlenecks might be.
So instead of just seeing the final result of a purchase, we get to see that journey from requisition to payment. That's going to be super valuable for finding ways to make the process more efficient.
Exactly. Imagine you want to see how long it typically takes for a purchase order to be fulfilled. Or maybe you want to identify suppliers who consistently have long lead times. A snapshot SEP table can help you uncover those kinds of insights.
Okay, I'm starting to see how powerful it can be to structure procurement data in a thoughtful way. But we've been assuming that information about a product or a supplier or even a contract just stays the same. In the real world, that's rarely the case, is it?
You're absolutely right. And that brings us to the second part of our deep dive. Slowly changing dimensions, or SCDs as they are often called. This is all about how we handle those inevitable changes to our dimensions.
Okay, so let's say a product gets recategorized or a supplier moves to a new address. How do we capture those changes without messing up our entire data warehouse?
That's a great question. And before we get into the specific techniques, it's really important to remember that this isn't just a technical challenge. We have to work with the business users
Right, the people who are using this data every day.
to understand how they need to analyze those changes.
Because if we just assume they only care about the most up-to-date information, we could be losing out on valuable historical insights.
Exactly. So let's dive into the different ways we can handle these slowly changing dimensions. And we'll start with the simplest approach, type 0.
Type 0, even before type 1. That's interesting. What's so special about it?
Well, think of type 0 as the unchangeable type. It's reserved for those attributes that, at least in theory, should never change.
Okay, give me a real-world example.
The book mentions the original credit score of a customer when they first enter the system. That shouldn't be modified. Another example is the date itself in our trustee date dimension.
Okay.
January 1st, 2023 will always be January 1st, 2023, even though we might add additional attributes to describe it, like if it was a holiday or a weekday.
Okay, yeah, makes sense. Those are kind of fundamental data points that we should mess with. But in the real world, most things are far from static.
Right.
What happens when those changes do occur?
That's where type 1 comes into play. It's the simplest way to handle changes, but it has a trade-off.
Okay, I'm all ears. Tell me about type 1 and why it might not always be the best choice.
With type 1, we just overwrite the old attribute value with the new one. Imagine that Intel Kids software we talked about earlier. Let's say it gets moved from the education department to games and puzzles. With type 1, we would just update that product dimension or row to reflect the new department.
So it's like hitting replace on a document. We only keep the newest version.
Yeah, exactly.
Convenient, but we lose all that history.
And that loss of history can be a real problem for certain analysis. Let's say we want to see how each department performed over the last year. With type 1, we wouldn't be able to see how much of IntelliKids' sales were originally in education before the move. We would only see the total sales for games and puzzles, including those sales that happened before the change.
So type 1 might be okay for attributes that aren't really crucial for historical analysis, like maybe a minor update to a product description.
Right.
But for something like a department category, it seems like we would be missing out on valuable data.
Absolutely. And that leads us to the workhorse of slowly changing dimensions, type 2. This is where things get interesting because now we can actually capture the evolution of our data.
All right, type 2. Time to unveil the secret weapon for preserving history.
Haha.
How does it work?
With type 2, instead of overwriting the old attribute like we do in type 1, we add a new row to our dimension table every time there's a change.
So going back to our IntelliKids example, instead of updating that product row, we would create a brand new row with the new games and puzzles department.
Exactly. And each row represents a specific state of the product's attributes, valid for a certain time period.
Oh, okay.
So we would have one row for IntelliKids in education, valid up until the day it moved, and then a new row for IntelliKids in games and puzzles, valid from that day forward.
Okay, so I'm starting to see how this creates a timeline of changes. But what happens to our fact table?
Yeah.
Do we have to go back and change all the old purchase records for IntelliKids to point to this new row?
That's the best part. We don't have to touch the fact table at all. Each fact table row already has a date associated with it.
Right.
So any purchases of IntelliKids made before the department change would still point to that original education row, and any purchases made after the change would point to the new games and puzzles row.
So the fact table is automatically kind of partitioned based on the purchase date.
Exactly.
That's pretty cool. No need to rewrite history.
And this way, our reports and analysis accurately reflect the state of things at the time each purchase was made. So if we want to analyze sales by department for the last year, we can clearly see how IntelliKids contributed to each department during the relevant time period.
This is definitely better for historical analysis than type 1.
For sure.
But managing all these extra rows, doesn't that get a little tricky? How do we keep track of everything?
Another great question, and that's where those administrative columns come in. Effective date, expiration date, and the current row indicator. Those are our trusty guides for navigating all this historical data.
Okay, let's break those down one by one. The effective date and expiration date basically just tell us when that dimension row is active, right?
Exactly. So for our original Education IntelliKids row, the effective date might be the date the product was first introduced, and the expiration date would be the day before it moved to games and puzzles.
Okay.
And the new games and puzzles row would then become effective from that day forward.
Got it.
And its expiration date would be sometime way in the future. Or until another change hours, of course.
Makes sense. And the current row indicator, that's the one that just tells us which row has the most up-to-date information for a product, right?
That's it. It's like a little flag that helps us quickly identify the current state of things.
Right.
These columns are super important for our ETL processes. Remember, that's how we load the data into the warehouse. And for building accurate reports and analysis.
Okay, type 2 definitely sounds like the way to go in most cases.
Yeah.
Where capturing accurate history is important. But the book also mentions a type 3. Which seems a bit more specialized. When would we use that one instead of type 2?
Type 3 is an interesting one because it aims to provide both the historical and a current perspective all at the same time. It's not used as often as type 2, but it has its place.
Okay, now I'm curious. When would we need that kind of dual view of our data?
Think about a situation where sales territories are being reorganized.
Okay.
With type 2, we could accurately track historical sales based on the old territories, but what if the business also wants to see how those past sales would look under the new territory structure?
Oh, so we want to analyze the past through today's lens. I can see how that would be useful for planning and understanding long-term trends.
You got it. And that's where type 3 comes in handy. Instead of adding a new row like we do with type 2, we add a new attribute to the existing dimension row to store that previous value. So we would have an attribute for the current territory and another attribute for the previous territory, all in the same row.
So it's like keeping two parallel universes within the same dimension. Interesting. But does that mean we lose that clear historical record that we get with type 2?
Not really. We still have that historical information, but it's linked to the current row. So if we run a report by the current territory, those past sales will be included.
Okay.
But we can still see that they were originally from a different territory.
Okay, type 3 seems like a good solution for certain situations where we need that dual perspective. But the book also talks about some even more specialized techniques, like type 4, 5, 6, and even a type 7. When do we use those?
Those techniques are more for specific and oftentimes more complex situations,
Okay.
especially when we are dealing with attributes that change very frequently or dimensions that have a huge number of rows, and they often combine elements from the basic techniques we've already discussed.
All right, my brain is starting to feel a little full. Maybe we should take a quick breather and come back to talk about those more advanced techniques in the last part of our deep dive. And we're back, ready to tackle the more, I guess, exotic side of slowly changing dimensions, those hybrid techniques that kind of combine the best of what we've learned. I have to admit, my curiosity has definitely piqued. Where do we even begin?
Well, so far, we've been talking about changes that happen at a relatively, leisurely pace. But what happens when you have attributes that are changing constantly, especially in a large dimension with millions of rows? Adding a new type 2 row for every little change would be a nightmare.
Yeah, a dimension table would be absolutely massive. So what's the secret to handling those rapid-fire updates?
Type 4, the mini dimension technique.
Mini dimension, that sounds kind of cute. What's the idea behind it?
It's all about breaking down a large, complex dimension into smaller, more manageable chunks. So let's say you have a huge customer dimension
Okay.
with hundreds of attributes. Some of those attributes, like demographics, for example.
Right. Things like age, income, marital status, those are always changing.
Exactly. Instead of tracking every single change to those attributes in the main customer dimension, we create a separate mini dimension just for demographics.
So each row in this mini dimension would represent a unique combination of those demographic attributes.
Pretty much, yeah. And because we're dealing with ranges or categories instead of exact values, like age groups or income brackets, the number of possible combinations stays relatively small.
Ah, that's clever. We avoid bloating our main customer dimension with tons of extra rows for every minor demographic change. But how do we actually use this mini dimension in practice?
We connect it to both the fact table and the main customer dimension. So every time we add a new row to our fact table, let's say a customer makes a purchase, we include both the customer key and the demographics key, the one that was valid at the time of that transaction.
So we're capturing a snapshot of their demographic profile at that moment, even if it changes later.
Exactly. And we can also link that current demographics key back to the main customer dimension. So that allows us to analyze customer demographics independently, even if they've changed over time.
That's pretty brilliant. I can see this mini dimension concept being really helpful for any attribute that's changing a lot and being used for analysis.
Right.
But what about those even more specialized techniques, like type 5, 6, and 7? When do those come into the picture?
Those are our hybrid techniques.
Okay.
They combine elements from the other approaches we've talked about to address some very specific situations. They can get pretty complex, but the main idea is to find the right balance between preserving history, keeping the data accurate, and making sure things are still manageable from a technical point of view.
Okay, before we get totally lost in the weeds here, can you give me an example of when we might need one of these more advanced techniques?
Sure, let's go back to our friend the IntelliKids software. We've been keeping track of its department changes using Type 2, so we have a nice historical record. But let's say the business wants to analyze those past sales using both the original department and the current department.
So they want to be able to see both the historical and the current view, side by side. I guess that would be useful for understanding how product categorization has impacted sales over time.
Exactly, and that's when Type 6 really shines. Instead of adding a new row like we do with Type 2, we just add a new attribute to the existing dimension row to track the current value. So the original attribute still has the historical value.
So for IntelliKids, we would have two department attributes, original department and current department.
Yep, exactly. That way we can analyze the data using either the historical or the current department assignments. Gives us that dual perspective the business is looking for.
Okay, type 6 makes sense. What about type 5 and 7? When are those the right tool for the job?
Type 5 combines the mini dimension concept from Type 4 with a Type 1 outrigger on the main dimension. This gives you both historical and current views on frequently changing attributes without cluttering up the main dimension. It's like having a little mini archive for each main dimension row.
So you get the best of both worlds, history and efficiency. And type 7, that one sounds even more mysterious.
Type 7 is it's definitely a bit complex. It uses dual foreign keys in the fact table,
Okay.
one pointing to the historical Type 2 dimension and another pointing to a view of the current Type 1 attributes. It can be really powerful for certain types of analysis, but it's not something you would use every day.
All right, I think I've reached my limit for slowly changing dimension complexity for one day. This has been incredibly helpful, though. What are some of the key takeaways you want our listener to walk away with today?
I think the most important thing to remember is that data is constantly changing, and if you don't account for those changes, you can end up with inaccurate analysis and bad decisions.
Right.
And this applies to all kinds of data: procurement data, customer information, even personal data.
It's like that saying, the only constant is change. And with the world becoming more and more data-driven, knowing how to manage and interpret that change is going to be more important than ever.
Couldn't agree more. And choosing the right slowly changing dimension technique really depends on what the business needs and the kind of data you're working with. There's no magic bullet.
So to our listeners out there, we really encourage you to think about how these concepts apply to your own work
Yeah.
or even your personal life. How do you keep track of changes to important information? How do you make sure the decisions you're making are based on good data?
It's something we all deal with, whether we realize it or not. Having a framework to think about these things can be really helpful.
Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of procurement and slowly changing dimensions. We hope you've learned a lot. And until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and try to keep those dimensions from changing too quickly.